By the summer of 1944, the war on the Eastern Front had entered a completely new phase, and the balance of power was shifting in a way that even the German High Command could no longer ignore. 3 years earlier, Nazi Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, sending millions of soldiers across the Soviet border in a massive attempt to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign. At first, the invasion appeared unstoppable. German armored columns smashed through Soviet defenses, encircled entire armies, and advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Cities fell one after another as the Wehrmacht pushed toward Moscow, Leningrad, and the oil fields of the Caucasus. But the war that Adolf Hitler believed would end quickly instead turned into a brutal and exhausting struggle. The German defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 had shattered the illusion of German invincibility, and the massive tank battles of Kursk later that year confirmed that. The Red Army was growing stronger with each passing month. Soviet factories deep inside the country were producing enormous quantities of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, while millions of soldiers filled the ranks of the Red Army. By 1944, the Soviet Union had transformed its military into one of the most powerful forces in the world. German forces on the Eastern Front were still fighting fiercely, but they were increasingly on the defensive. Soviet offensives were growing larger, more coordinated, and more destructive, pushing German units westward step by step. For the German leadership, the growing strength of the Red Army posed a terrifying question that few dared to say openly. If the Soviet advance continued at this pace, the fighting would eventually reach the borders of Germany itself. That terrifying possibility began to take shape during the summer of 1944, when the Soviet Union launched one of the most devastating offensives of the entire war. In June, the Red Army began Operation Bagration, a massive assault against German Army Group Center in Belarus. Soviet commanders had secretly assembled an overwhelming force of soldiers, tanks, artillery, and aircraft for the attack. When the offensive began, the German front lines were hit with an explosion of firepower unlike anything they had faced before. Soviet artillery pounded German positions for hours before waves of tanks and infantry surged forward. Within days, entire German defensive sectors collapsed. Communication between German units broke down as Soviet armored spearheads pushed deep behind the front lines, surrounding divisions that suddenly found themselves trapped. German commanders attempted to send reinforcements, but the scale of the disaster was enormous. Army Group Center, one of Germany's strongest formations on the Eastern Front, was shattered in a matter of weeks. Cities such as Minsk and Vitebsk fell as Soviet forces advanced rapidly westward. Thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured, while others retreated in chaotic columns along roads clogged with destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment. Reports arriving at the German command headquarters described the same grim picture everywhere. Soviet forces were advancing faster than the German army could reorganize its defenses. Defensive lines that had held for years were collapsing in days. Entire sections of the front were simply disappearing. As the Red Army surged forward across Eastern Europe, it was becoming clear that the strategic situation had changed permanently. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Soviet advance was no longer aimed only at reclaiming lost territory. It was pushing steadily toward Germany itself. As the summer of 1944 continued, the destruction of German forces on the Eastern Front became impossible for the German leadership to hide or deny. Operation Bagration had shattered Army Group Center with a speed and scale that stunned even experienced commanders. Entire divisions had been surrounded and destroyed within days, leaving huge gaps in the German defensive lines across Belarus and eastern Poland. Soviet armored units pushed forward through those gaps with relentless momentum, advancing along roads crowded with destroyed vehicles, abandoned artillery, and retreating German columns. Cities that had been under German control for years were falling one after another as the Red Army continued its westward drive. German commanders desperately attempted to form new defensive positions, but the situation on the ground made it increasingly difficult. Many units had lost large numbers of men and equipment during the earlier battles, and replacements arriving from Germany were often inexperienced soldiers with minimal training. Fuel shortages and constant Soviet air attacks further complicated any attempt to stabilize the front. German officers on the battlefield could see clearly that the Red Army was growing stronger with every passing week. Soviet armies now moved with a level of coordination and firepower that had not existed earlier in the war. Massive artillery barrages shattered defensive positions before waves of tanks and infantry surged forward to exploit the damage. Once a breakthrough was achieved, mechanized formations advanced rapidly into the German rear, cutting supply routes and trapping entire formations before they could escape. These tactics repeatedly forced German units into chaotic retreats as commanders struggled to avoid encirclement. For many soldiers fighting along the front, the sense of control that had once defined the German advance in earlier years of the war had completely disappeared. At the same time, Germany faced an equally dangerous situation in Western Europe. Only weeks before the Soviet offensive began, Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The opening of this second front placed enormous pressure on the German military. Reinforcements that might have been sent east to strengthen the collapsing defenses against the Red Army were instead being diverted toward France in an attempt to contain the Allied invasion. German commanders on the Eastern Front quickly realized what this meant for their situation. They were being asked to defend a massive front line against an increasingly powerful enemy while receiving fewer resources and fewer reinforcements than before. Reports sent back to the German command headquarters described exhausted divisions attempting to defend long stretches of territory with dangerously thin numbers of soldiers. In some sectors, entire defensive positions were held by units that were only a fraction of their original strength. Meanwhile, the Red Army continued to push forward across Eastern Europe with growing confidence. Soviet forces crossed into Poland and advanced toward the Vistula River, bringing them closer to Germany's eastern frontier than ever before. News of the advancing Soviet armies began spreading among German civilians living in eastern territories such as East Prussia. Refugees from the front started moving westward, carrying alarming stories of the speed and violence of the Soviet advance. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the possibility that the fighting could soon reach German soil was becoming a frightening reality. Inside the German leadership, a troubling realization was beginning to form. The Red Army was no longer simply reclaiming lost territory. It was steadily moving toward Germany itself. By late 1944, the front line in the east had moved closer to Germany than it had ever been since the beginning of the war. Soviet armies had pushed across Poland and were now approaching the borders of East Prussia, one of the most important regions of Germany itself. For German civilians living in these eastern territories, The war that had once seemed distant was suddenly becoming terrifyingly real. Refugee columns began appearing on the roads, families fleeing westward with carts, horses, and whatever possessions they could carry. They brought with them stories of the Red Army's rapid advance and of the brutal battles that had destroyed towns and villages across Eastern Europe. German authorities attempted to maintain order, but the growing movement of refugees revealed the scale of the fear spreading among the population. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed the war as a defensive struggle that Germany would ultimately win. Now, the same propaganda machine struggled to explain why Soviet forces were suddenly so close to German territory. Reports reaching German headquarters described the same pattern everywhere along the Eastern Front. Soviet forces were attacking with overwhelming numbers of tanks, artillery, and infantry. German defensive lines were repeatedly broken, forcing units to retreat further west in an attempt to avoid encirclement. Commanders in the field warned that if the Red Army continued advancing at its current pace, the fighting could soon move directly onto German soil. Inside the German High Command, the strategic implications of this development were becoming increasingly alarming. Germany had built large defensive systems across Eastern Europe during the earlier years of the war, but many of those positions had already been lost during the Soviet offensives of 1944. The Red Army was now approaching the final defensive barriers that protected the eastern regions of Germany itself. German generals began urgently discussing how to slow the Soviet advance before it reached those borders. New defensive lines were ordered, and reinforcements were rushed toward key sectors where Soviet breakthroughs seemed most likely. But these measures faced serious limitations. Germany's military resources were no longer what they had been earlier in the war. Many of the Wehrmacht's most experienced divisions had already been destroyed in earlier battles. Others were scattered across multiple fronts, from Italy to France, where German forces were struggling to hold back Allied armies advancing from the west. The German army was now fighting a two-front war against powerful enemies who possessed far greater industrial capacity and manpower. Despite these difficulties, the orders coming from the highest levels of command remained uncompromising. German units were instructed to hold their positions at all costs and to prevent Soviet forces from entering German territory. Yet as new battlefield reports continued arriving from the east, the situation grew more alarming with each passing week. Soviet armies were crossing rivers, capturing strategic cities, and pushing steadily closer to Germany's borders. The Red Army was no longer fighting to reclaim its own land. It was moving toward Germany itself, and the possibility that Soviet soldiers might soon enter the country was becoming increasingly difficult for the German leadership to deny. By the beginning of 1945, the Eastern Front had reached a moment of crisis for Germany. Soviet forces had spent months consolidating their gains across Poland while preparing for the next massive offensive. Along the Vistula River, Soviet commanders quietly assembled enormous concentrations of troops, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. German intelligence reports warned that the Red Army was preparing something on a scale not seen since the great offensives of 1944. Yet the German army no longer had the strength to respond effectively. Many divisions defending the front were severely weakened after months of constant retreat and combat. Some units were holding long defensive sectors with only a fraction of their original manpower. Supplies of fuel and ammunition were becoming increasingly scarce, while Allied bombing was steadily weakening Germany's industrial capacity. German commanders along the front understood the danger clearly. If the Red Army launched another major offensive, the thin defensive lines might collapse completely. Despite these warnings, the orders from the German leadership remained unchanged. Positions were to be held at all costs, and retreats were forbidden unless explicitly authorized. German soldiers dug defensive positions along the frozen ground while waiting for the expected Soviet assault. When it finally came in January 1945, it began with a thunderous artillery barrage that stretched across the entire front. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously, shaking the German defensive lines with an overwhelming storm of explosions. The bombardment was followed by waves of Soviet tanks and infantry advancing through the shattered defenses. Within hours, the scale of the attack became clear. Soviet armored formations began breaking through multiple sectors of the front, overwhelming German positions that were already dangerously under strength. German units attempted to hold their ground, but the pressure of the assault quickly forced many formations into retreat. Entire defensive sectors began collapsing as Soviet spearheads pushed rapidly westward, cutting roads and supply routes behind the German lines. The speed of the Soviet advance stunned even experienced German officers who had fought on the Eastern Front for years. Once the breakthroughs were achieved, Soviet armored units surged forward with relentless momentum. German attempts to form new defensive lines were repeatedly disrupted as Soviet forces advanced deeper into the rear areas. Cities and towns across Poland fell one after another as the Red Army continued its rapid push toward the west. Within weeks, Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing major strategic positions and forcing German units into chaotic withdrawals. Refugee columns soon began appearing across eastern Germany as civilians attempted to escape the approaching front. Families fled in wagons, carts, and crowded trains, moving westward through freezing winter conditions while rumors spread about the speed of the Soviet advance. German authorities attempted to organize evacuations while also rushing military units toward the Oder River, the last major natural barrier before Berlin. Yet the situation on the battlefield was becoming increasingly desperate. Reports arriving at the German command headquarters described Soviet forces advancing faster than German units could reorganize their defenses. Entire regions that had been considered secure only weeks earlier were now threatened by the approaching Red Army. The Soviet offensive had not only broken through the front lines, it had opened the road toward Germany itself. For the German leadership, the implications were now unmistakable. The Red Army had crossed the final defensive zones in Eastern Europe and was advancing directly toward the heart of Germany. The war that had once been fought far from German territory was now moving rapidly toward the country's own borders, and the final confrontation was drawing closer with every passing day. By February 1945, the consequences of the Soviet offensive had become impossible for the German leadership to ignore. The Red Army had reached the Oder River, only about 70 kilometers from Berlin itself. In military terms, this distance was shockingly small. Soviet artillery could soon be positioned close enough to threaten the German capital directly, and armored units were already preparing for the next phase of the advance. German forces rushed to establish defensive positions along the Oder in a desperate attempt to slow the Soviet momentum. Engineers worked day and night, constructing trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified firing positions, while reinforcements were hurriedly brought in from other sectors. Many of these units consisted of exhausted soldiers pulled from shattered divisions or newly formed formations with little training. Some were composed of teenagers and older men who had been mobilized during the final stages of the war. Despite these efforts, German commanders knew the strategic situation had changed beyond repair. The Red Army now possessed overwhelming numerical superiority in soldiers, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Soviet armies had spent years learning from earlier defeats and were now executing large-scale operations with extraordinary coordination. Massive artillery barrages shattered defensive lines before armored columns surged through the gaps and advanced rapidly toward their objectives. German forces could still fight fiercely in defensive battles, but they no longer had the strength to stop the Soviet advance completely. The front line along the Oder became the last barrier standing between the Red Army and Berlin. Across Germany, civilians were beginning to understand the scale of the danger. Refugees from eastern regions poured into cities further west, bringing with them stories of the battles that had swept across Poland and East Prussia. Long columns of wagons, carts, and military vehicles crowded the winter roads as people attempted to flee the approaching front. Railway stations overflowed with families hoping to escape before the fighting reached their towns. German authorities attempted to maintain order while preparing defenses around major cities, but the sense of urgency was growing. The war that had once seemed distant was now approaching Germany's heartland. Within the German leadership, the realization slowly became unavoidable. The Red Army was not merely pushing German forces backward, it was advancing toward Berlin itself. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Germany as an unstoppable military power, but the battlefield reality in early 1945 told a very different story. The Soviet Union had transformed its army into a massive war machine capable of overwhelming Germany's remaining defenses. The final stage of the conflict in Europe was approaching rapidly. German forces would attempt to hold the Oder Line and defend the capital for as long as possible, but the strategic balance of the war had already shifted beyond recovery. When it became clear that the Red Army had reached the final defensive barrier before Berlin, the moment marked one of the most dramatic turning points of the entire war. The long struggle on the Eastern Front was approaching its final chapter, and the Soviet advance toward Germany would soon lead directly to the battle that would decide the fate of the Third Reich.